The novel is about an unexpected road trip between a teacher and former student, and the scene will be that I'll read is the end of chapter 2. The protagonist, Mr. Brown, and this former student, Willie Drummond, are in their first stop at Harper's Ferry, having one of several, unless you read the novel, then it's one of many contentious conversations. Malik turns back to where the rivers merge. He places his hands on his head like he did in the store this morning, but nothing else is similar to then. That was an act of defiance. What's happening now is different. Possibly surrendering to the limitations of what we can know, what we can understand, how we make sense of a history overflowing with more hate than any history should contain. He swipes his hands in the direction of the monuments and historical signs and turns away. And I think how the pathway toward understanding our history is a cruel one. I want to praise his pursuit of learning, reinforce that his tough questions will lead him somewhere profound. But the words I say out loud sound something like, "You thirsty? We still have those sodas in the truck." He looks at me. No, he's looking through me. While at first I thought his look was one of feeling sorry for himself, I now sense that he may also be feeling sorry for me, for being unable to move us forward, for not knowing where to go or what to do, possibly sensing that I may be much more of this person than what he envisioned, or mistakenly what he remembered. "Lily, I hear you," I say quietly. I want to tell him that I'm learning silence is complacency, but I'm concerned that he might ask how I was allowed to be a teacher without knowing this before. To tell him that sharing his emotions is a good thing, that his confusion is a good thing, that finding fury and understanding history is a good thing, but I say none of this, thinking how I've always found a false safety in silence. "You know what?" Malik says. His tone balances anger and wisdom, contains a potentially dangerous cocktail of emotion for a young black man from the perspective of many white people. But a small crew attacking that army as this was, that's some authentic soldier shit right there, Mr. Brown. Blake points to the still perimeter of what remains of the long fallen armory. "One of those signs over there," he throws his arm in the other direction, talks about how John Brown's raid was an early step in the civil rights movement. You get that, Brown? I don't answer him, silently wondering whether he shares statement or question. He pushes himself from the top bar of the railing, keeping his arms extended when I tell him it's time to go. The walk back to the truck is silent, and we race to roll the windows down, the doors ajar to let the built-up heat out of the truck's cab. "You know where it all comes down to, Brown?" I yet don't answer, feeling he's delivered a few other points under the umbrella of what it all, whatever that means, comes down to. It comes down to what we're willing to risk for someone else to be free. I repeat the sentence in my head, wondering if I've heard this somewhere else, by someone else. He opens the soda and plops his right arm out the window. The hot and sticky air, if it can even be called air, shifts from pleasant to angry, and I want to tell Malik that what he shared is profound. Instead, I wish Malik would tell me that I'm a waste of his time, rip himself from the steaming truck and head to the train station at the bottom of the village. "Well, let me get something else off my chest," he continues before licking his lips. Both of us border on dehydration despite the soda. "You know, believe it or not, I remember some stuff from your class." And I perk up, longing for reflections like this, and I assume what comes next will follow suit. "You know, even Jamal Lewis remember you speaking about people around the world who were prosecuted. Someone that was powerful, eye-opening. That group, like, what do you even call them? The Dalai Lama crew in China? That group in Chiapas, Mexico? Yo, did I say that right?" No, he didn't, but I nod approving him. "That group in Peru called the Shiny Path. I remember them. Lewis and I used it in our comic strip." Silently, I'm amazed by how much Malik remembers. A total win. They close the doors at the exact same time, and the smash of old metal in unison has a unique and shallow grandness to it. "But that's not it, Mr. Brown," he continues. "I remember you talking about all these groups around the whole world that got mistreated, except the ancestors of the students sitting right in front of you.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Tonight is a conversation about thought, but it is also a conversation about attention, responsibility, and what stays with us
over time. Before thought became a book, it was a lived experience. Eric, to begin, can you tell us a little about that lived experience, the world of teaching that this book grows out of?
So, yeah, we all have, yes, our lived experience. I understand the question. Yes, first, the novel is fiction, but I do think about my profession for 25 years working in classrooms and working with education nonprofit. I started teaching a week before 9/11, and I remember being in the classroom that day, and I had my two best friends. One decided he was going to go to war, the other decided he was going to be a firefighter, and I knew that day that I wanted to teach. But it probably took me 25 years, or yeah, 25 years of evolution from that moment, knowing I wanted to teach, but recognizing that to teach, you have to show up as a learner, as a student yourself. And that took me a long time to really figure out. But I think probably the DNA of what I think my work has been is realizing early that while I may have struggled to lead instruction on the complicated themes of history, I knew how to make connections with students, and I knew how to really pass on that sense of agency and that sense of presence. And it just created opportunities for me to be part of a lot of unique learning that didn't always align to what the lesson plan had. And I think about that a lot, and I think about those relationships, and those relationships are really at the hard story.
At some point, lived experience become reflection. When did you first realize that these experiences were asking to be written, not just remembered?
Well, when my writing started, I didn't start to write a book. And the writing started, so this is probably a period of time that we all want to block out, but May and June of 2020 is what 5 or 6 years and decades ago. And my three sons in our basement in school, my amazing wife working on the front lines of emergency medicine at the ER, working for a nonprofit that was transitioning programming for thousands of students in school to doing it virtually, seeing former students online, blocks from our home, much like for everyone, COVID restriction protests, Black Lives Matter protests. And I just started writing because it was quiet. And it wasn't peace and quiet, but it was quiet. And I needed a place to just share these polarities and really dive into figuring out what I understood. And the writing started to take a shape into dialogue. The dialogue started to take shape between characters. The character kind of showed themselves as a teacher and former student. And by fall 2020, I just realized I had around 40,000 words and a little bit of loose structure. And I don't know if I needed a project, probably not the right word of need, but that's when I decided to kind of move with it, evolve.
For those of you who may be encountering thought for the first time tonight, this is a book that moves between in classrooms, institutions, and moments of moral tension. When you were shaping this book, what did you want readers to understand early on about school systems, not just spaces of learning?
What I knew early on, and what I knew probably up to like around a few weeks ago, was I didn't write the book with any messages for anyone. I didn't want to tell. I wanted to create stories that let people come to their own conclusions. I kept thinking of, during the writing process, people are tough. People are resilient, but systems are fragile. And we think of schools as arenas where it's supposed to be about teaching and learning, but schools operate with countless systems of transportation, health, of feeding kids, of language, of technology. When we think about what life was like just 6 years ago, those were the systems that shut down. And it's hard to think how teaching and learning could happen when the systems are crumbling around you. And I guess that early message I was thinking about in the writing was just the fragility of systems.
One of the ideas that runs through Todd is that teaching alone is not always enough preparation for the world students are entering. What is the book asking us to confront about the limits of teaching when it is separated from history, context, and lived reality?
I'm glad we're getting the easy questions out of everybody. Thank you. So I think the greatest disservice to years of my own teaching, and I see this is a chronic problem, is we think about teaching as instruction and assessments without taking the time to understand our students' lived experience, their history. What are they arriving? What's the world that they are arriving in your classroom with? And it's such a missed opportunity, because that human connection is what we need to move forward, and it's what teachers and students need to make those connections. And I want to lean into the book. I don't know if this answers your question, but I want you to put people with really good intentions in difficult situations. And I think that's what I kept thinking about that throughout. And then after a while, I realized I didn't need help doing that. I needed help getting them out of sticky situations. And then I realized that wasn't my job as the writer. But I think just that making that human connection is all we can, is probably the greatest practice we can implement to better prepare our students for the future, because nothing teachers can do and should do, or nothing they can do should fully prepare young people for the future.
Thank you. Let's talk about silence for a minute. Silence appears repeatedly in this book, in meetings, in classrooms, and in moments where something could be said, but isn't. How did you come to understand silence as something active rather than neutral? And why was it important for that silence to remain unresolved in the story?
So I like the framing of that silence is not neutral. And the activity of silence goes through different phases based on where we are in our lives. But when you think of silence, often in a classroom, unfortunately, the perception is disengagement, or a student hasn't done their work, or a student is reluctant, or, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But I also wanted to use silence as a place to dive into tension. And that silence is thinking. And I think silence is sometimes the most powerful thing you could extend to someone if your heart and your energy is showing them and yourself that you're trying to listen to their perspective. No, I didn't want to put people in situations where they were amongst company that agreed with everything they talked about. I wouldn't have sat down to do that. And I think that silence, that unresolved tension, that is really human. And I was drawn to that. I was really drawn to that.
Silence is indeed powerful. As the book moved forward, the pandemic centers a narrative. For readers, it feels less as an interruption and more as an unveiling. What did the pandemic reveal about schools and institutions that had previously been easier to manage or ignored?
So I don't see the novel as a pandemic story, but I recognize that we can't separate the story from the pandemic. And I think the more that, as the writing evolved, I realized that the pandemic actually didn't create problems. It exposed realities that were just right under the surface. And when I think again about the fragility of systems, it took a pandemic to set off all these systems that surround our human relationships. My care for you, my relationship with you doesn't change, but when everything around you changes outside, something changes inside. And I saw the pandemic as the story evolved as almost as a guest in the story. But it did expose how we care for each other when the systems around us are crumbling. And the pandemic crumbled our systems for a period of time.
During this period, we see institutions relying on language, protocols, and structure at a time when reality was shifting quickly. What did you hope readers would notice about how institutions respond when their usual tools no longer work?
I hope everyone reads the book. But I didn't write it with a message. I wanted to focus on the storytelling. And again, I think about the resiliency of people and how intertwined our human connections are to the systems that surround us. I mean, we had an event scheduled here in late January, just snow and ice, and no one could get here. It didn't change how I care about each other, it just changed how we could be together. And when I think about and that was almost a minor weather inconvenience. Here we had a pandemic, and I keep coming back to the fragility of our systems. And what is a more important system in our society? Our schools. So I don't know if you're going to accept that.
Give it. But there is a moment in the book when that many readers find especially powerful, the scene at the gate. Even without knowing every detail, it's a moment about access, boundaries, and responsibility. Why was that scene important for you to write about with such restraint?
So I like talking about that scene with you when we first discussed the interview, and what that scene. First of all, what's so fascinating about that particular scene is it's relatively minor as far as how the plot advances for the story. It was probably the only one of the few, if not the only scene that when I read it when I wrote it, I knew that I captured something that exceeded what I thought I would capture. And when I read it, I found it. And it gave me pause, and I said, why can't I do that on all the other pages? But for a lot of the other pages, I was trying to tell a story, and that scene, the story just told itself when I got about these subtle moments, and a teacher thinks about success and progress based on student learning and the metrics that occupy our schools. And this was just about a human connection. And we think of, and a teacher often thinks about a student's learning in response to their instruction, but this was a very subtle moment where a teacher was responding to a student's curiosity. And you can't plan those moments, and we all live for those moments. And those moments are subtle, they're unplanned, they don't always tell you that they're there, but they're often transformative in our lives, and sometimes they're transformative in the student's life. And I found that a really interesting scene too. And I'm also glad we're talking about characters. So that was a lot about institutions.
What stands out about that moment is not what happens, but what does not happen. There is no clear resolution. Why was it important for this book to resist closure there?
So I didn't start the book to end the book. And I really focused on the story moving. But I know in life when there's closure, I sometimes will evaluate, especially with a book. We're in an amazing bookstore, and I read an amazing book. I won't use the word amazing again. And it has clear closure, and then I start to grade it. I start to think about the quality of the writing, the quality of the characters, quality of the plot. But when I read a book that doesn't have a clear ending, then I think about the themes in the story. And those types of books have always spoken to me. And I think that a scene could resonate more in one's heart and soul without having a closure that sometimes we look for in life. I thought that scene allowed. I think that unresolved tension felt very human. I was really drawn to scenes like that. I'm glad that resonated with you.
Now, Todd repeatedly returns to the idea that responsibility does not always end when a professional role ends. What questions about responsibility do you hope readers to continue to sit with after finishing the book?
So I'd love to hear what you're sitting with, because I can answer this question very easily. What I knew I wanted to do was put people with really good people with well-meaning intentions in difficult situations, and that occupied the first like quarter of the writing. Then I felt stuck of like, what are we doing now? But it's about with teaching we often talk about where are the guardrails? Where are the limits of when a teacher's responsibility starts and ends beyond the classroom? And I wanted to dive into that theme as well. But I don't know if there was messages that started in the writing process.
As we begin to come toward the end of our conversation, I want to widen the lens for everyone here. When you think about Todd as a whole, what do you most hope readers understand about what teaching and caring ask for people beyond the classroom?
The theme that I kept thinking about in the writing process was, how do we care for people in society that feels like it's tearing us apart? And how do we meaningfully care for people? I don't know if that's that wasn't a message for you. That was the message for me, is as sticky or as disappointing or as frustrating as writing this scene is. How do you do it still knowing these people who are doing things that are not helpful or can be even hurtful, deep down they still care for each other? And I kept thinking about that, especially towards the end of the book, when characters are making decisions that are really frustrating and don't appear to be in the best interest of the people they're making these decisions for. So this theme of how we care for each other, but also, especially in professional like teaching, the writing the book helped me better understand that sometimes the best way to take care of other people is to do a better job taking care of yourself. And I can't believe that I found the writing process to be that transformative with that lesson. Is that these characters were realizing, and I hopefully one of the places where the book ends is some of the main characters are realizing that the work that they need to do to be the person they want to be, there's a pathway. They found that. Or they didn't. That's up to you. But
Many books about education focus on outcomes. This book feels more concerned with impact that is harder to measure. What do you hope Todd contributes to a larger conversation about teaching and legacy?
So I am familiar, and I know there's other educators here in the group. I am familiar with like the common metrics and outcomes that are measured throughout education. But at the end of the book, when I started to think about this idea of like where does the teacher, the protagonist, where does he end? Where do some of his colleagues end? Based on the events or following the events. And I think about this theme of not traditional education outcomes, but how do we measure a young person feeling seen? How do we measure a young person feeling cared for? How do you measure a young person who that their voice is heard? And I think that if the teachers, and especially the protagonist, understood that these are the metrics and how you teach, that without these metrics, everything is just instruction and repetition. If he could have learned these lessons and the verdict is out of whether he did or did not, I think that he has a chance to be the teacher that his students need him to be. And I think it's time, and you're slowly seeing this in more progressive academic environments of changing what are the metrics that we're measuring. Because I know that the metrics that I just spoke about, if you have those foundations in place, the students who are leaving your classroom are more prepared than when they arrived, and not just more knowledgeable or more informed.
I appreciate the depth of your responses and how you address the emerging themes in the book.
And I'd like to open the conversation, and my dear audience, I'd like to invite you to ask questions.
Okay. As I've been facilitating a session where we wouldn't let anybody talk without a microphone, so that's why. No, I don't need it. I just didn't know. So I really found myself enjoying, enjoying the. I was really curious and immersed in the sections from Brown's childhood. Like I kind of really looked forward to those sections because they told me a little bit about the U.S. Day. And I wondered just if there were any inspirations, like how did some of those pieces of Brown's childhood, did you wake up and think about them? Did it come to you over time? Just, I'm curious about your approach to writing those sections of the book.
So for the backstory, I enjoyed writing the backstory for both main characters a lot. And actually, a lot of the backstory, a lot of the classroom scenes were edited out, and some of the backstory scenes were edited out, probably appropriately so. If you're gonna put characters with such mental and moral gaps on the page, I needed to go there. I needed to create that space. And I tried with both backstories to not share a lesson that was learned, but a failure of being connected to it, failure being loved by the people that needed love at the time that they needed it. All the situations and lessons that the teacher and the young man, the former student, are learning, they were both victims to really challenging backstories and upbringings. And this is what I mean. And I had that in mind when I think of the greatest work that we could do to help others heal is to heal. And if not, you bring your pain, you bring your past with you everywhere. And we're in another cycle of another generation here and everywhere else around the world who's being traumatized by pain. And I tried to capture that in the story, but I got lost in the backstory, and that's where I could credit very good editing.
Thank you. Here, I've always been thinking about like when you sat down, you said you sat down to write. I find it interesting when you sat down and you wrote fiction and didn't write like your sort of, keep saying it's not a lesson, it's not a lesson. That's called taught. It's not a lesson, And it's not. But we take away so much. But I'm just kind of curious, like how, like when your mind did you think I'm going to sit down and write? Okay, I'm going to sit down and write a story versus my story and my reflections. And if you can just sort of speak to that a little bit for us, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah. So years ago when I talked about writing, I have a friend who was here tonight, and I remember we were sitting on our porch, and I shared, and I have my friend Grace is a former One World Education board member, and one of our board members asked that I should write a book about the themes of the word, and I shared that with my friend, and I'll clean up her response, but it was that would be blank 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 blank, and you're a good storyteller. You should think about writing fiction. And that just kind of stayed with me. But I wasn't necessarily thinking about that when I started writing. That writing was an escape. It was the only quiet place in my life. And it wasn't even quiet. And I felt tonight, I thought about my wife who didn't have this quiet. She was trying to buy this noise from the sirens. And it just kept evolving. And even to the point of working with an editor, I didn't know that the book, for me, checking that box was finishing this story. At no point was that you were reading. Up till the very end when I shared it with an editor, and I shared this checked a box for me, and it helped me find multiple pathways to healing that I was looking for. I'm grateful for this process. And if you think it has a literary weight beyond me, I'd like you to tell me. And she really leaned in and said, this is a book that could serve as a springboard to like authentic dialogue. And then some of my former students who were the first readers felt like this is not static, this is fluid, and we could run with this, and people could run with this. And I blocked all that out for those first couple of years. It was just, I felt closure on that. I felt closure on writing, and how it ended up being the place where it could be read was a whole nother space. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, but I do have one follow up with Jeff. So about your own personal healing, if you just like say, I guess, see how these characters, or how that had met to your risk called.
I'm sitting there with characters who are struggling to do real work on their lives, to remove the obstacles. Now, naturally, the obstacles in my life are not the obstacles experienced by the characters in this book. But I decided years ago I wanted to lean into every roadblock in my life to better understand how it's slowing me down or holding me back. And I realized there were some obstacles that, because they were not interfering in my day-to-day or my responsibilities to my family or my work, that maybe they're just aspects of my life, maybe not obstacles or problems at all. But the more I spent time with these characters who I realized, by their inability to heal, they are not only crippling their life, they're destroying the lives of people around them. And I felt both grateful to not be anywhere near that situation, and I realized there was opportunities to think differently. And it was right around the time when my mother passed away 2 years ago. She was a writer, and she suffered from a lot of setbacks. And it just helped me challenge, see her differently. That, again, really good people with no authentic, worthy intentions navigating complicated dilemmas. And some people have the privilege of only navigating a few of those in their lives, and for some people, it's a reoccurring cycle.
So I have a question. As you were talking, I was thinking about experiences with teachers where there have been unintended consequences. I like unintended consequences. And there was one teacher I had, and I just loathed her teaching. But now, later in life, what she taught me is a real gift. I realized how privileged I was to be tortured by this woman, that it gave me skills that I hadn't had. And so I wondered about the character, JB, and his relationship with Malik and the other students, and what maybe just off the top of your head, maybe are the unintended consequences that JB has experienced or is experienced or may experience as a consequence of, all this dynamics.
So it's interesting. There's a couple of like main characters who are educators, the principal, 2 or 3 teachers, and especially with the principal and the teacher you're talking about, the protagonist JB. I've had multiple people say that's the principal I want in my kid's school, and then people saying I would pull my kid out of a school with that principal. That teacher was a teacher I would not want my child to be in. At the end of the book, I would have wanted my kid to be a teacher in that classroom. And then people say the exact opposite. And I think this is really interesting to see these characters so uniquely different. And this is a reflection of our values, maybe not always our values, but our style of how our values land in the world. And a lot of readers, and actually, right, I don't know if they were readers, but they definitely asked me, hey, what happens to so-and-so at the end? And that's up to you. I don't know. I'm hopeful that these characters had the access to the information and the will and the pathway to continue on this journey of moving forward. Because I think that the journey of them together wasn't neatly steps forward, but they weren't steps backwards either. And I think that's like reflects where all of our lives are at our most challenging, most graceful moments. I don't know if I answered your question, Jimmy.
Well, thank you so much, guys.